This case, it's got everyone talking, and it's for good reason. It really gets to the heart of what a president can and can't do. We're doing a deep dive into the case against Donald J. Trump, specifically all about his efforts to overturn the 2020 election results.
Right.
And, we're not just reading headlines here. We're diving into the actual motion filed by Special Counsel Jack Smith, which is basically a roadmap of the government's argument for why Trump isn't immune from prosecution.
What's so fascinating about this particular case is we're seeing in real time the legal system grapple with the boundaries of presidential power.
Yeah.
Like, we are in uncharted territory.
Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit. The case centers on Trump's actions after he lost the 2020 election, particularly the lead up to January 6th. But there's a twist. The Supreme Court already ruled on part of this.
Right. They already decided that Trump is immune from prosecution for actions related to the Justice Department during that time, because they saw those actions as part of his official presidential duties.
So he's off the hook for some things, but not for others.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where this motion comes in.
Exactly. This motion focuses on all the stuff that the Supreme Court didn't rule on.
Okay.
And the big question is, were these actions taken by Trump as president, which might give him immunity, or as a private citizen and candidate, which could be a whole different ballgame?
So if I'm understanding this correctly, it's like if I mess up while I'm on the clock at work, my company might be liable. But if it's just me personally messing up, I'm the one who's in trouble.
That's a good way to think about it. And it's this distinction that the case really hinges on, which gets complicated because, of course, Trump was both president and a candidate at the same time.
Right. This whole president versus candidate thing is fascinating. It's like the prosecution has to draw a line in the sand, right? So how are they trying to do that? What's their strategy?
Well, they're really diving deep into specific actions that Trump took after the election.
Okay.
And they're trying to prove that these weren't the actions of a president who's, serving the nation, but of a candidate who's desperate to cling to power.
Okay, so they're saying it's not just about what he did, but why he did it.
Exactly.
So what are some examples? What are they pointing to?
So they point to three main categories of actions. First, his pressure on Vice President Pence to try to get him to overturn the election results.
Now, didn't the Supreme Court already say something about Trump talking to Pence? Wasn't that already decided?
It was. They ruled that conversations between Trump and Pence, specifically about the election certification and with Pence acting in his official capacity, were part of Trump's presidential duties.
Okay.
However...
So he's in the clear there.
Well, prosecution is arguing that this case is different.
Okay. Different how?
They're saying that this pressure on Pence, it wasn't about, fulfilling some official duty of the president. It was entirely driven by Trump's personal interest in staying in office. And they go deep into the Constitution with this. They highlight how the framers, they intentionally excluded the president from having any role in choosing their successor.
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want a president to be able to, appoint themselves to another term, right?
Exactly. This whole thing, this fear of a president manipulating their way into staying in power, that's not just some dusty old concern. That gets at the very heart of what makes a democracy a democracy.
Yeah.
And the prosecution is arguing that Trump's attempts to pressure Pence into overturning the election, that was a dangerous step in that direction.
And it's chilling when you think about it. Those chants of hang Mike Pence during the January 6th riot. I mean, obviously we can't directly link those to Trump's words, but still.
And the motion doesn't directly link them, but it certainly raises the question about what happens when a president puts that kind of pressure on their own vice president to overturn the will of the voters.
Right. So we've got this pressure on Pence. What's the next category they're focusing on?
The second category is all about Trump's dealings with state officials after the election.
Okay.
The motion is full of examples of Trump calling up officials in key states, states that he lost, and urging them to overturn the results.
So he was working the phones, trying to get those vote counts changed. But I mean, wasn't that his right as president to get involved in these election disputes?
That's what his lawyers will likely argue.
Mm-hmm.
But the prosecution, they counter that by pointing out that Trump only contacted officials in states that he lost, and even more specifically, only Republican officials.
Interesting.
So to them, that pattern, it suggests a candidate who's just trying to overturn his own defeat, not a president acting in the best interests of the nation.
It's like he was laser focused on on specific states, almost like he was running a campaign within a campaign.
Exactly, exactly. And it even includes direct quotes from Trump's calls to these officials. Like, for instance, when he told Georgia's Secretary of State that there were more ballots than voters.
Wait, he actually said that?
He did, and the prosecution uses that quote and others like it to show that Trump, he was using inflammatory and misleading information in his attempts to pressure these officials. These weren't, the measured words of a president trying to just make sure everything was above board. These were the pleas of a candidate who just could not accept defeat.
So yeah, so far it does seem like they're building a case that these actions were more about Trump the candidate than Trump the president. So what's that third area they're focusing on?
This one might seem a bit more obvious. Trump's public statements and actions.
Okay.
They argue that, in many ways, Trump treated his post-election rallies, his media appearances, as kind of extensions of his campaign. Not so much as opportunities to speak as the president.
So even his rallies, which were happening while he was still in office, those are being brought into this.
Yeah, and especially the one that he held on January 6th, right before the riot at the Capitol.
Right.
They point to the language that he used there, how it echoed his campaign rhetoric, claims about a stolen election, promises to take back our country, calls to action for his supporters. They argue that this wasn't the kind of language that a president typically uses when they're addressing the nation.
Yeah.
It was the language of a candidate who was still fighting for a win.
Okay, and what about his tweets? Because, it feels like we can't talk about Trump without talking about his Twitter account, right?
Absolutely. And in fact, the motion, it actually dedicates a significant portion to Trump's use of Twitter.
Wow. Did they actually, include his tweets as evidence?
They did.
Wow.
They argue that Trump blurred the lines between, his personal opinions, his campaign messaging, and official presidential communications on that account.
Right.
And they even include an example of a retweet from an account that was promoting something called Operation Pence Card.
I vaguely remember that. That was all about, putting pressure on Pence to not certify the election results, right?
Yes. And while it might seem like a small detail, the prosecution uses it to illustrate how Trump used his platform to amplify messages that supported his goal of staying in power.
It's amazing how much power a single retweet can hold. Okay, so we've got the pressure on Pence, the calls to state officials, the rallies, the tweets. It's a lot. But it really does seem to all revolve around this idea that he was acting as a candidate, not the president. What do you think? Is the prosecution making a convincing case so far?
I think they're certainly building a compelling narrative.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that this is just one side of the story.
Right. We haven't heard how Trump's lawyers plan to defend these actions. What could they possibly say to counter all of this?
Well, that's what makes this case so fascinating. We'll have to wait and see what arguments they present and what evidence they might use to paint these actions in a different light.
This feels like just the tip of the iceberg, I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, but there's one more layer to this whole presidential immunity puzzle that we need to unpack. Okay, so we've been talking about this whole thing with the prosecution trying to prove Trump's actions were those of a candidate, not the president. But there was this one argument in this motion that really, I don't know, it kind of threw me for a loop. They're saying they need to prove that watching TV and using Twitter weren't official actions in this context.
It does sound a little strange, I have to admit, when you put it like that.
Right.
But I think it really highlights how unprecedented this whole situation is. We're in uncharted legal territory here.
Yeah.
Trying to apply these centuries-old principles to 21st century technology and behavior.
Yeah, I get that, the Constitution couldn't have predicted Twitter or whatever, but still. Watching the news, being active on social media, those feel like pretty standard parts of a modern president's day-to-day, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. And the motion acknowledges that. But they're saying, in this specific case, they have to draw a clear line. It's not about whether Trump could watch TV or tweet as president. It's about whether those activities were directly connected to this potential effort to overturn the election.
So, okay, if I'm following you, they need to separate out Trump watching cable news in the residence just for general information versus him seeing something specific that then made him, I don't know, call up a state official and pressure them.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. They're trying to differentiate between just kind of personal consumption of information versus actions that might be an abuse of power. It's all about proving intent and causation.
And that's where it gets really tricky, right? Because how do you separate those things out? A president doesn't just stop being president because they're, I don't know, scrolling through Twitter on the toilet.
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so legally and conceptually challenging. It forces us to really examine the very nature of presidential power in in the digital age.
Yeah.
You know, if a tweet can incite a riot, as we saw on January 6th, can it also be considered an official act in the context of an alleged conspiracy?
Yeah.
These are questions that the courts are going to have to really wrestle with.
That's a lot to process. So as we try to tie all these threads together, for you, what's the biggest takeaway? What does it all mean?
I think what we're seeing here is, it's really a defining moment for presidential accountability. This case, it's not just about Donald Trump. It's about the limits of executive power in a democracy and just how fragile our institutions really are. The outcome of this, it's going to have far-reaching consequences for future presidents and how they navigate that line between, their official duties and their personal interests.
You've given us a lot to think about. It's clear this is about so much more than just one election, you know what I mean? This is about the very soul of American democracy.
It really is. And while we all wait to see how this legal drama unfolds, I think the most important thing we can all do is stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, shedding light on a truly critical moment in our nation's history. For the deep dive, this is host name.
And expert name.
Reminding you to stay curious and keep exploring the world around you. We'll be back next week with another deep dive into a topic that's shaping our future. Until then, thanks for listening.